I watched from the back door of the church. My sons stood around my casket, and my daughters wiped their tears with handkerchiefs. No one noticed that a living dead woman was watching her own funeral. Attending my funeral was the strangest experience of my life, but sometimes this is the only way to bring a family together. I was sitting in the last pew, wearing a black dress and veil that covered most of my face. Nobody pays attention to an old lady who arrives late to a funeral. After all, everyone's eyes were on the person who was supposed to be inside the casket, me. But there I was, at my own funeral service, watching my children finally under the same roof after 15 years. It all started 3 weeks ago when I found a lump in my breast. The doctor's appointment was just routine, or so I thought. Dr. Meyer's face turned serious as he examined me. "We need to run some tests, Mrs. Walsh," he said, his voice carrying that professional concern doctors perfect over years of delivering bad news. The test came back negative. No cancer, just a benign cyst that would dissolve on its own. I should have felt relieved, but as I sat alone in my empty house that evening, a strange thought occurred to me. What if the tests had been positive? What if I had received a death sentence instead of a clean bill of health? Who would come to my funeral? My 4 children, Richard, Thomas, Elizabeth, and Catherine, hadn't been in the same room since their father's funeral 15 years ago. The reading of Harold's will had descended into a bitter fight over the family lake house, and from that day forward, my children stopped speaking to each other. Family holidays became a diplomatic nightmare of alternate visits and separate celebrations. For 15 years, I'd tried everything to reunite them. I'd pleaded, reasoned, guilted, even tried to bribe them with the promise of changing my will. Nothing worked. Richard wouldn't speak to Thomas. Elizabeth refused to be in the same room as Catherine. My grandchildren grew up barely knowing their cousins. That night, after my doctor's appointment, I poured myself a glass of Harold's Old Whiskey, something I did only on special occasions, and found myself staring at our family photo album. Pictures of the children growing up, playing together at the lake house, Richard teaching Thomas how to fish, Elizabeth braiding Catherine's hair on the dock. What had happened to that family? I took another sip of whiskey, feeling it burn down my throat, when the idea hit me. A terrible, brilliant, desperate idea. The one thing that had brought them all together, despite their animosity, was their father's funeral. They had maintained a fragile truce for exactly 1 day, united briefly by grief. If they'll only come together for a funeral, then I'll give them a funeral, I whispered to the empty room. I began planning the next morning. First, I called my oldest friend Mabel, who lived 2 towns over. We'd been friends for over 60 years, and she was the only person I could trust with something this outrageous. When I told her my plan, she was silent for a long moment. "Dolores Walsh, have you completely lost your mind?" she finally said. "Probably," I admitted. "But Mabel, they need this. I need this. Before I really do die, I want to see my family together again. Will you help me?" She sighed that deep sigh that told me she thought I was crazy, but would help me anyway. "What do you need me to do?" With Mabel's help, I found a funeral director who owed her a favor. Her late husband had helped his son get into college years ago. He was reluctant at first, but eventually agreed to stage a fake funeral, as long as we kept his name out of it if things went south. Next came the death certificate. This was trickier, but my neighbor's daughter was a clerk at the county records office. She thought we were planning an elaborate birthday surprise for the family and agreed to process the paperwork without asking too many questions. The hardest part was writing the obituary. How do you sum up your own life? What accomplishments do you highlight? What failures do you gloss over? In the end, I kept it simple. Dolores Walsh, loving mother and grandmother, passed away peacefully in her sleep. In lieu of flowers, please bring memories to share. Now, watching my children from the back of the church, I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake. The pain on their faces looked so real. Had I gone too far? The funeral service began with Pastor Robert stepping up to the pulpit. He was in on the plan too, but just barely. I told him I was staging my death as part of a family reconciliation intervention. He didn't approve, but he also didn't refuse when I doubled my usual donation to the church building fund. "We are gathered here today to celebrate the life of Dolores Walsh," he began, his voice carrying that perfect blend of solemnity and comfort. I watched my children's faces as he spoke. Richard, my oldest, sat stiffly in the front row, his jaw clenched tight. He was the spitting image of his father. Same stubborn chin, same way of holding himself like he was bracing for impact. Beside him was his wife, Karen, whom I'd never particularly warmed to. She kept patting his arm in what I supposed was meant to be a comforting gesture, but Richard didn't seem to notice. Thomas sat as far from Richard as the front pew would allow. My second son had always been the sensitive one, the peacemaker. Now he sat with his shoulders hunched, staring at his hands. The last time we'd spoken, he'd mentioned trouble in his marriage, but looking at him now, sitting alone, I realized he and Diane must have finally separated. On the other side of the aisle sat my daughters. Elizabeth, my practical, no-nonsense first daughter, looked composed, as always, but I could see the redness around her eyes. Next to her was her husband, James, and their 3 children, all teenagers now, all looking uncomfortable in their formal clothes. Catherine, my youngest, was openly weeping. She'd always worn her emotions for everyone to see. Beside her was someone I didn't recognize, a woman with short, dark hair who kept her arm protectively around Catherine's shoulders. I made a mental note to ask about that later, assuming there would be a later, assuming this whole scheme didn't blow up in my face. The church was full of other familiar faces, neighbors, old friends, even a few of my former students when I taught high school English. I was touched by how many people had come, though I suspect some were just curious about the drama of the Walsh family reunion. Pastor Roberts invited Richard up to deliver the eulogy. This was not part of my plan, and for a moment, I felt a flutter of panic. What would my oldest son say about me? Richard stepped up to the pulpit, straightening his tie nervously. He unfolded a piece of paper, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "My mother was a complicated woman," he said, and I had to suppress a snort. Complicated was one way to put it. She loved fiercely and expected the same in return. She never did anything halfway, not teaching, not parenting, not gardening, not even arguing. There was a ripple of knowing laughter through the congregation. Richard's face softened slightly. When I was 10, I broke her favorite vase, a family heirloom passed down from her grandmother. I tried to hide the evidence, but Mom had this way of looking at you that made the truth come spilling out. I confessed, terrified of being punished. Instead, she sat me down and taught me how to glue the pieces back together. It took us 3 days. I remembered that vase. Still had it, actually. The cracks visible, but the piece whole again. I hadn't thought about that incident in years. She said something I never forgot. "Richard, broken things can be mended if you have patience and the right kind of glue." His voice cracked slightly. "I think Mom always hoped our family could be mended too." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Elizabeth stared straight ahead, but I could see her blinking rapidly. Catherine's sobs grew louder. "I wish—" He stopped, composed himself. I wish we had found that glue. I wish we had given her the family she deserved in these last years. By the time Richard returned to his seat, I was fighting back tears myself. This was not how I had expected the service to go. I had anticipated awkwardness, perhaps some perfunctory nice words, but not this raw emotion, not this genuine grief. Pastor Roberts invited others to share memories. To my surprise, Thomas stood up next. As he walked to the front, he passed Richard without looking at him. Thomas stepped up to the pulpit, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges. Unlike Richard, he hadn't prepared any notes. That was typical of Thomas, always speaking from the heart, for better or worse. "My mother," he began, then stopped, swallowing hard. "My mother once told me that forgiveness isn't something you do for the other person. It's something you do for yourself." He glanced briefly at Richard, then away. I didn't understand what she meant back then. Maybe I still don't. He took a deep breath. "When I was in college, I crashed Mom's car, totaled it completely. It was the only car she had, and she needed it to get to work. I was terrified to tell her, convinced she would never forgive me. But when I finally confessed, she just asked if I was hurt. When I said no, she said, 'Then nothing important was damaged.' I remember that day clearly. The car had been a financial burden to replace, but the thought of losing Thomas had put everything in perspective. I'd never told him how I'd cried later that night, alone in my bedroom, overwhelmed with relief that he was safe. Mom forgave easily, Thomas continued, his voice stronger now. Too easily, maybe. She forgave us for things we should have had to work harder to make right. He looked directly at Richard now. She forgave us for breaking her family and never putting it back together. A tense silence fell over the church. Richard's face had gone rigid. Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Catherine just kept crying, her shoulders shaking with each sob. "I'm sorry, Mom," Thomas said, looking at the casket. "I'm sorry we couldn't be what you deserved." As Thomas returned to his seat, I noticed something unexpected. Richard nodded slightly at him, the barest acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was the first non-hostile interaction I'd seen between them in 15 years. Pastor Roberts, clearly sensing the tension, quickly asked if anyone else would like to speak. To my surprise, Elizabeth stood up. My practical, reserved daughter rarely volunteered to speak in public. She walked to the pulpit with characteristic poise, her back straight, her steps measured. Once there, though, she seemed to deflate slightly. I had a complicated relationship with my mother. She wanted so much for me, for all of us, sometimes more than we wanted for ourselves. Elizabeth paused, gathering her thoughts. When I was in high school, I was offered a scholarship to study abroad for a year. I was too afraid to accept it. The night before the deadline, Mom filled out the application for me and left it on my desk with a note that said, "Fear is just excitement without the breath." I was furious with her for overstepping. I smiled faintly at the memory. Elizabeth had indeed been furious, refusing to speak to me for days, but she had signed that application. That year changed my life. It gave me confidence, perspective, opportunities I never would have had otherwise. Mom knew what I needed, even when I didn't. She looked down at her hands. I wish I had thanked her properly for that, for all the times she pushed me when I needed pushing and caught me when I needed catching. As Elizabeth returned to her seat, I saw Catherine rise, still crying. The dark-haired woman beside her seemed to ask if she was sure, but Catherine nodded firmly and made her way to the front. My youngest stood at the pulpit, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak for several long moments. Just as Pastor Roberts was about to step in, she found her voice. Mom loved celebrations. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, any excuse to bring everyone together.
She would spend weeks planning, cooking all our favorite foods, even for the smallest occasion.
The last time we were all together as a family was at Dad's funeral, Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength. Mom tried so hard after that to bring us back together. Every holiday, she would call each of us, trying to convince us to come home, to talk to each other. She never stopped trying. I felt a pang of guilt. It was true. I had never stopped trying to reunite them, but perhaps I had gone about it all wrong. Nagging, pleading, manipulating, none of it had worked, and now I was attempting the most manipulative tactic of all. Last Christmas, Catherine said, wiping her eyes, I told Mom I couldn't come because I had other plans. The truth was, I just couldn't face another holiday with missing chairs at the table. It was easier to stay away than to see the family broken. I think we all felt that way. It was easier to stay away than to do the hard work of fixing what was broken. The dark-haired woman in the pew was watching Catherine with such tenderness that I suddenly understood who she must be. Catherine had come out to me 3 years ago, but she'd never introduced me to anyone special. I felt a fresh wave of grief, not from my fake death, but for all the life events I'd missed because of this family rift. Mom deserved better from us, Catherine concluded simply, then returned to her seat, where the woman immediately took her hand. Pastor Robert stepped back up to the pulpit. The family has prepared a slideshow of memories, he announced, gesturing to a screen that had been set up beside the casket. This was another surprise. I hadn't planned a slideshow. As the lights dimmed and music began to play, What a Wonderful World, one of my favorites, images of my life began to appear on the screen. There I was as a young woman, standing proudly in front of my first classroom. There was my wedding day with Harold, both of us looking impossibly young and hopeful. Then came the children, first Richard, then Thomas, then Elizabeth, then Catherine. Birthday parties, school plays, camping trips, graduations. I watched, transfixed, as my life flashed before my eyes, not in the way people describe before death, but literally projected on a screen for everyone to see. Who had put this together? The photos kept coming. The lake house that had caused so much trouble, summer barbecues, winter sledding, Harold teaching the boys to fish, me teaching the girls to bake. Then came photos I'd never seen before. Richard's wedding, Thomas's college graduation, Elizabeth with her newborn first child, Catherine at what looked like a pride parade. My children's lives had continued with moments of joy and significance, even as they drifted apart from each other, and in some ways from me. The final image was a family photo taken at Harold's 60th birthday, just the year before he died. All of us together, smiling, unaware of how quickly it would all fall apart. The screen faded to black, and there wasn't a dry eye in the church, including mine. Pastor Robert stepped back up to the pulpit. The family is inviting everyone to the cemetery for the burial service, followed by a reception at my house. This was the riskiest part of my plan. I needed to get to the cemetery before everyone else and then somehow slip away before the casket was actually put in the ground. Mabel had arranged for the funeral director to delay the burial due to some paperwork issue, giving me time to get back to the house before the reception. As people began to file out of the church, I stayed in my seat, keeping my head down. Richard paused in the aisle, looking back at the casket with such an expression of profound regret that I almost stood up right then and confessed everything. But he turned away, following the others out, and my moment of weakness passed. When the church was nearly empty, I slipped out a side door where Mabel was waiting in her car, engine running. "Well," she asked as I climbed in, "how was your funeral?" "Surprisingly moving," I admitted, pulling off my veil. "I think it might actually be working, Mabel. They're talking to each other at least." "Of course they are," she snorted, pulling away from the church. "Nothing brings people together like a funeral. The question is, will they still be talking when they find out you're not actually dead?"
Mabel drove us to the cemetery, taking a back route to avoid the funeral procession. The plan was for me to lurk behind a large mausoleum, close enough to observe, but not so close that someone might recognize me. "This is completely insane," Mabel muttered as she parked on a service road behind the cemetery. "You know that, right?" "It's working, though," I insisted. "You should have seen them, Mabel. They're finally acknowledging each other, talking about forgiveness. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for. Or it could be the thing that makes them never speak to each other or you ever again," she countered. "Dolores, it's not too late to call this off. We could contact the funeral director, tell everyone there was a mistake, that you're in the hospital, not dead." I considered it for a moment. The raw emotion I'd witnessed in the church had shaken me. The eulogies, the slideshow, the genuine grief, it all made me question what I was doing. But then I remembered 15 years of failed attempts to reunite my family, 15 years of separate holidays and missed connections. "No," I said firmly, "we stick to the plan. Drive around to the main entrance and let me out. Then go to my house and make sure everything's ready for the reception." Mabel shook her head but did as I asked. As she drove away, I adjusted my veil and made my way through the cemetery to the freshly dug grave that was supposed to be mine. I positioned myself behind a large stone angel, close enough to see and hear, but hopefully hidden from view. The funeral procession arrived a few minutes later. The pallbearers, Richard, Thomas, and 2 men I recognized as neighbors, carried the empty casket to the gravesite. Everyone gathered around, and Pastor Roberts began the committal service. From my hiding place, I could see my children standing together, closer than they had been in the church. Catherine was still crying, now leaning slightly against Elizabeth, who had her arm around her younger sister's shoulders. Richard and Thomas stood side by side, not touching, but not maintaining their usual careful distance. As ashes to ashes, dust to dust, we commit the body of Dolores Walsh to the ground in the sure and certain hope of resurrection to eternal life. As planned, the funeral director approached Pastor Roberts and whispered something in his ear. The pastor nodded and addressed the gathering. "I've just been informed that there will be a slight delay with the actual burial due to some paperwork issues. But please, everyone is welcome to proceed to Mrs. Walsh's home for the reception. The family will return later for a private burial." Perfect. This would give me time to get back to the house and into position for the next phase of my plan. I waited until everyone had left, then hurried back to the service road where Mabel had promised to have someone pick me up, her grandson Joey, who thought we were pulling a harmless prank on a family friend. Joey drove me to my house, where Mabel let us in through the back door. The caterers were already setting up in the dining room, another expense I justified as necessary for my elaborate scheme. "Everyone will be here in about 15 minutes, Mabel warned. "Are you sure you want to go through with the rest of this?" I nodded, though my confidence was wavering. "Help me change," I said, heading upstairs. The plan was for me to change out of my funeral clothes into my normal attire, then hide in my bedroom until the right moment to make my grand entrance. But as I changed, I couldn't stop thinking about the genuine grief I'd witnessed. My children weren't just going through the motions, they were truly mourning me. The thought made me both touched and increasingly uneasy about my deception. "Mabel," I called through the bedroom door, "can you come in here?" She entered, carrying a glass of water and some aspirin, correctly guessing that I had a stress headache coming on. "I need to ask you something," I said, taking the pills gratefully. "Did you make that slideshow at the church?" She shook her head. "No, that wasn't me. I assumed the kids put it together." That meant my children had collaborated on something, had shared photos and memories, had worked together despite their differences. It was exactly what I'd been hoping for, evidence that they could still function as a family. But so why did it make me feel even worse about my deception?
I could hear the front door opening downstairs, voices filling my home. The reception was beginning. Mabel squeezed my hand and went down to play her part, the grieving best friend who would be managing the event. Through my bedroom door, I could hear the house coming to life. Footsteps, conversations, the clink of glassware. I'd always loved hosting gatherings, filling my home with people and laughter.
Now I was hiding in my own bedroom while people mourned my death just one floor below. The absurdity of it hit me all at once, and I had to sit down on the edge of the bed. After about an hour, I crept to the top of the stairs to listen. The reception seemed to be going well. I could hear conversations, even occasional laughter, that peculiar kind that often breaks through at funerals when someone shares a funny memory of the deceased. I was about to return to my room when I heard my name mentioned. I paused, straining to hear. It was Richard's voice. Never wanted the lake house anyway. Mom was right. We should have just sold it and split the money. Then why did you fight so hard for it? That was Thomas, his voice tight. Because Dad left it to all of us, not just you. It was the principal. The principal? Thomas's voice rose slightly. The principal cost us 15 years, Richard. Was it worth it? There was a long pause, and I held my breath, worried they were about to fall back into their old patterns of argument and estrangement. No, Richard finally said, his voice quieter now. No, it wasn't worth it. Nothing was worth this. I crept down a few more stairs, wanting to hear better, to see if this was really happening, my children finally talking about the rift that had torn them apart. I sold my share years ago. After Diane and I split up, I couldn't afford to keep it, and honestly, it just reminded me of everything that went wrong. Who did you sell to? Elizabeth's voice now joining the conversation. Some developer. They were turning the whole area into condos, I think. I sold too, about 5 years ago. Karen and I were having money troubles. So did I, Elizabeth added, when James lost his job. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Catherine's laughter broke through. Are you kidding me? All of you sold? I'm the only one who kept my share? You kept yours? Richard sounded incredulous. Of course I did. It was Mom's favorite place in the world. I couldn't bear to let it go completely. So this whole time, Thomas began, we've been avoiding each other over a property none of us even fully owned anymore, Elizabeth finished. Mom would find that hilarious, Catherine said, and there was a ripple of agreement, even a few chuckles. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. The lake house dispute had been effectively resolved years ago, and none of them had known because they weren't speaking to each other. It would indeed have been hilarious if it weren't so heartbreaking. She tried so hard to get us to reconcile, Elizabeth said softly. All those calls, those attempts at family holidays. Remember the Christmas she sent us all the same gift? Those photo albums with all the old family pictures? She was so obvious about it, Richard said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Subtlety was never Mom's strong suit. I wonder what she'd say if she could see us now, all together again, but too late for her to see it. I clutched the banister, torn between the joy of hearing my children talking normally again and the growing horror at what I'd done. They were reconnecting just as I had hoped, but it was happening organically through shared grief and memories. My elaborate deception suddenly seemed not just unnecessary, but cruel. Before I could decide what to do, I heard a new voice, unfamiliar, authoritative. Excuse me, is there a Mabel Harrison here, or any member of the Walsh family?
I'm Richard Walsh, I heard my oldest say. What's this about? Sir, I'm Detective Collins with the county police. We've been contacted by the cemetery about a potential situation involving your mother's remains. My blood ran cold. This was definitely not part of the plan. What situation? Thomas asked. Sir, when the cemetery workers returned to complete the burial, they discovered that the casket appears to be empty. There was a collective gasp, followed by confused murmurs. I gripped the banister tighter, my mind racing. How had this happened?
The casket wasn't supposed to be opened again until after everyone had left. "What are you saying?" Elizabeth demanded. "That someone stole our mother's body?" "We're investigating all possibilities, ma'am. Body snatching, while rare, does occur. Another possibility is that there was a mix-up at the funeral home, though they deny this. Or what?" Richard pressed. The detective paused. "Or there was never a body to begin with?" A heavy silence fell over the room. I could almost feel the confusion and shock radiating upward. This was not how I had planned to reveal myself. I'd imagined a dramatic entrance, a tearful but ultimately joyful reunion once I explained my motives. Now the truth was being dragged out in the worst possible way. "That's ridiculous," Thomas said. "We all saw her at the viewing yesterday." Had they? The casket had been closed during the viewing, with just a photo of me displayed on top. The funeral director had explained that this was due to the condition of the remains, a phrase vague enough to discourage questions. "Actually, sir, we've spoken to the funeral director. He's being quite cooperative now that we've mentioned potential charges of fraud. He claims he was paid to stage a fake funeral by Mrs. Walsh herself." I closed my eyes, cursing silently. The funeral director had caved immediately. So much for the favor he owed Mabel. "That's absurd," Elizabeth said, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice. "Why would our mother fake her own death?" "Ma'am, we're hoping you might have some insight into that. Do you know where your mother might be now?" This was spiraling out of control. If I didn't show myself soon, the police would launch a full investigation. Mabel could face charges. This had to end now. Taking a deep breath, I stood up straight and descended the stairs. The living room fell silent as I appeared. Every head turned, every face registered shock. The detective looked from me to my children and back again, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "Hello, everyone," I said, my voice shakier than I intended. "I can explain." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Catherine broke the silence with a sound between a gasp and a sob. "Mom?" Elizabeth sank slowly onto the couch, her face pale. Thomas just stared, his mouth slightly open. Richard's expression shifted from shock to confusion to something harder, colder. "Mrs. Walsh, I presume," the detective said, recovering his professional demeanor. I nodded. "Yes, I'm Dolores Walsh. As you can see, reports of my death have been exaggerated." "Ma'am, do you realize that faking your own death and filing false death certificates is a criminal offense?" Before I could answer, Mabel pushed through the crowd. "It was my idea. I convinced Dolores to do it. If anyone's going to be arrested, it should be me." "Mabel, no," I began, but Richard cut me off. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice tight with anger. "You faked your own death? Do you have any idea what you put us through?" I looked at my children's faces, shocked, hurt, betrayed, and the full weight of what I'd done hit me. This wasn't some harmless prank. I'd manipulated their genuine grief, had let them believe they'd lost their mother, all to force a reconciliation they might not have been ready for. "I'm so sorry," I said, and to my horror, I began to cry. "I just wanted you all together again. It's been 15 years of separate visits and missed holidays and grandchildren who barely know their cousins. I tried everything else." "So you decided to die?" Elizabeth asked incredulously. "That was your solution?" I wiped my eyes. "It worked, didn't it? You're all here. You were talking to each other. You were remembering the good times." "Under false pretenses," Thomas said quietly. "Because we thought you'd lost you." The detective cleared his throat. "I think this is a family matter that needs to be discussed privately. However, Mrs. Walsh, there are potential legal consequences here. I'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to make a statement." I nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. "I'll make sure she's there,"
Mabel promised, putting a protective arm around me. The detective looked around the room one more time, shook his head slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was dealing with, and left. The moment the door closed behind him, Richard turned to the other guests. "I think we need some privacy," he said, his voice controlled but strained. "Thank you all for coming, but under the circumstances—" People began to file out, murmuring awkwardly, casting curious glances my way. Soon only my children, their partners, Mabel, and I remained. Richard turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, "you're going to explain exactly what you were thinking."
I sat on the couch, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. My children arranged themselves around the living room, forming an unconscious semicircle of judgment around me. Only Mabel sat beside me, her loyal presence the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart. "Start from the beginning," Richard demanded, still standing, arms crossed over his chest. I took a deep breath and explained everything. The doctor's appointment that had sparked the idea, enlisting Mabel's help, the fake death certificate, the elaborate plan to reveal myself after they had reconciled. "I never meant for it to go this far," I finished lamely. "I was going to reveal myself during the reception, once I saw that you were all talking again." "But then the detective showed up," Elizabeth said flatly. I nodded miserably. "The funeral director wasn't supposed to open the casket again. I don't know what happened." "What happened," Thomas said, his voice tight, "is that your ridiculous scheme fell apart, as it was bound to do from the start." Catherine, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. "Do you have any idea what you put us through? I thought you were dead, Mom. Dead. I've been crying for days. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep." "I'm so sorry, sweetie," I said, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "Don't sweetie me. Not now. Not after this." I looked at each of their faces, seeing the hurt and betrayal written there. "I know I can't justify what I did," I said quietly, "but you have to understand, I was desperate. 15 years of trying everything else, watching my family fall apart, missing weddings and births and graduations because no one could be in the same room together. It was killing me slowly." "So you decided to kill yourself quickly instead? At least in our eyes?" "I didn't think about it that way. I just thought, if a funeral brought you together for your father, maybe it would work again for me. And it did, didn't it? You were all talking upstairs about the lake house, about the past." "That's not the point," Elizabeth said, exasperated. "You can't manipulate people like this, even with good intentions, especially your own children." Thomas, always the most reflective of my children, had been watching me silently. Now he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You know what the worst part is? It probably would have worked. We were remembering why we loved each other. We were remembering who we used to be as a family. And now that's all tainted because it was based on a lie." His words cut deeper than any of the others. He was right. The genuine reconciliation that had been building was now poisoned by my deception. "I heard you all talking about the lake house. You'd all sold your shares years ago except for Catherine. All this time you've been fighting over something that wasn't even an issue anymore." "That's not the point," Richard insisted. "The lake house was just a symbol of the real problem. Dad always favored Thomas. The will was the final proof." Thomas's head snapped up. "Dad favored me? Are you kidding? He was always prouder of you, the businessman, following in his footsteps. I was just the disappointment who became a teacher." "Both of you got more attention than we ever did," Elizabeth interjected. "Catherine and I were afterthoughts." "That's not true," I protested. "Your father loved you all equally." "Maybe," Catherine said, "but he didn't show it equally. And neither did you, Mom." I fell silent, stunned by her words. Had I played favorites without realizing it? Had I contributed to the rift that tore my family apart? The point is, Elizabeth continued, we had real issues to work through, real hurt feelings and misunderstandings, and instead of respecting that process, you tried to shortcut it with this charade. You're right, I admitted, tears welling up again. I just missed you all so much. I missed us, the family we used to be. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy with unresolved emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, and beneath it all, the undeniable pull of family bonds that had been stretched but not broken. Finally, Richard sighed deeply. I need some air, he said, and walked out the front door. Thomas glanced at Elizabeth, then at me, before following his brother outside. I should check on them, Elizabeth said, rising from her seat. Go, I told her, please. When she had gone, only Catherine remained, along with the dark-haired woman who had sat beside her at the funeral. Mabel, sensing that we needed privacy, murmured something about making coffee and disappeared into the kitchen. Mom, Catherine said, after a long pause, this is Rachel, my partner. We've been together for 2 years. Despite everything, I felt a small bloom of joy. It's wonderful to meet you, Rachel, I said sincerely. I wish it could have been under better circumstances. Rachel nodded awkwardly. I've heard a lot about you, Mrs. Walsh. Most of it good, she added with a small smile. Catherine told me you were the one who made the slideshow. It was beautiful. Thank you. Catherine looked surprised. You saw it? I was at the church, remember? In the back, wearing a veil. She shook her head, still processing this bizarre reality. This is so messed up, Mom. I know, sweetie. I know. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Catherine asked, were you really at the doctor's? Was there really a lump? I nodded. Yes, but it was benign, just a scare. She exhaled shakily. When we were told you had died in your sleep, I kept thinking there must have been something wrong that you hadn't told us about, some illness you were hiding so we wouldn't worry. I'm sorry for putting you through that. I never imagined how much pain it would cause. I guess I don't know what I thought. That you'd be sad but not devastated? That the prospect of reconciliation would outweigh the grief? That's the problem, Mom. You never really understood how much we love you, even when we're angry at each other, even when we're not speaking. Her words hit me like a physical blow. She was right. I had underestimated their love for me, had somehow convinced myself that their estrangement from each other extended to me as well. But their grief at the funeral was real, their eulogies heartfelt. I see that now, I whispered. Through the front window, I could see my sons and daughter in the yard. They weren't arguing, at least. They stood in a loose circle, talking, occasionally gesturing toward the house. Deciding my fate, perhaps. What do you think they'll do? I asked Catherine. She shrugged. I don't know. This is uncharted territory, Mom. None of the parenting books cover what to do when your mother fakes her own death. Despite everything, I laughed softly. Catherine had always been able to find humor in the darkest situations. For a moment, she smiled too. Just a slight one. For what it's worth, Rachel said, speaking up for the first time in a while. They've been talking more in the last 3 days than in the entire time I've known Kat. Whatever else this did, it got them communicating. Catherine shot her a look that clearly said not helping, but Rachel just shrugged unapologetically. The front door opened, and my other 3 children filed back in. Their faces were solemn, but no longer openly hostile. They'd reached some sort of decision. Richard, always the unofficial spokesperson for the siblings, cleared his throat. "We've been talking," he began, his tone measured. "What you did was wrong. Deeply wrong. It violated our trust, manipulated our emotions, and frankly, it was cruel." I nodded, accepting the judgment without protest. "But," he continued, and that single word made my heart leap, "we understand that it came from a place of desperation and love, however misguided. We're not saying we forgive you," Elizabeth added quickly. "Not yet. Trust takes time to rebuild. And we have conditions," Thomas said. I sat up straighter. "Anything," I promised. "Whatever you need." Richard exchanged glances with his siblings, then continued. "First, you need to fix the legal mess you've created. Talk to the detective, admit what you did, accept whatever consequences come." "I will," I agreed immediately. "First thing tomorrow." "Second," Elizabeth said, "we want you to see someone, a therapist. This," she gestured vaguely, encompassing the whole bizarre situation, "this isn't normal behavior, Mom. We're worried about you." The thought of therapy made me uncomfortable. I was from a generation that didn't easily discuss mental health, but I knew she was right. "I'll find someone," I promised. "Third," Thomas said, "we want to try family counseling. All of us, together. We've been avoiding the real issues for 15 years. It's time we dealt with them properly." I felt a surge of hope. Family counseling meant they were willing to work on our relationships, to try to heal the rifts. "Yes," I said eagerly. "Absolutely yes." "And finally," Catherine added, "no more schemes, no more manipulations, no more trying to force reconciliations. If we are going to fix this family, we do it honestly and openly, or not at all." "I promise," I said solemnly. "No more schemes." The four of them looked at each other, communicating silently, in that way siblings often can. Then Richard nodded, as if confirming a decision. "Okay then, we're willing to try." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start, more than I deserved, perhaps. "There's one more thing," Elizabeth said, glancing at her watch. "The kids are at my neighbor's house. They think they're at their grandmother's funeral. What do we tell them?" I hadn't considered this aspect. My grandchildren. What would they think of their grandmother now? "We tell them the truth," Thomas said firmly. "Or at least an age-appropriate version of it. That Grandma made a mistake because she was sad the family wasn't together, but she's okay, and we're going to work on being a family again." Richard nodded in agreement. "Kids are resilient. They'll probably think it's an exciting story to tell their friends. Their grandmother who came back from the dead." I winced at the phrasing, but couldn't argue with the sentiment. "I'd like to see them," I said tentatively. "When you think it's appropriate." "We'll figure it out," Elizabeth said, neither promising nor refusing. There was an awkward silence. Now that the immediate crisis had been addressed, no one seemed sure what to do next. It was Catherine who broke the tension. "Well, since we have all this funeral food anyway, we might as well eat it," she suggested pragmatically. "I'm starving." The absurdity of the situation, a funeral reception where the guest of honor was present, finally hit home, and a ripple of nervous laughter went through the room. Even Richard cracked a smile. "I could eat," Thomas admitted. As my children moved toward the dining room, I remained seated, unsure if I was included in the invitation. Mabel, ever vigilant, brought me a plate. "They'll come around," she murmured encouragingly. "Just give them time." I watched from the living room as my family gathered around the dining table. They weren't exactly comfortable with each other yet. There were still awkward pauses in the conversation, moments of tension when certain topics arose. But they were talking, sharing food, existing in the same space without open hostility. It wasn't the perfect reconciliation I had imagined when I concocted my elaborate scheme. It was messier, more tentative, fraught with unresolved feelings. But it was real, not manufactured.
And for the first time in 15 years, I allowed myself to hope that my family might heal. Rachel caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, encouraging nod. Then she said something that made Catherine laugh. A genuine laugh, not the strained politeness of recent years. Elizabeth responded, and soon all of them were chuckling, the tension easing slightly. Mabel squeezed my hand. "See?" she whispered. "Family." As I watched them together, I realized something important. Reconciliation couldn't be forced or manipulated. It had to grow naturally, built on honesty and mutual respect, even when that honesty was painful. I had tried to shortcut the process and had nearly destroyed any chance of real healing. But somehow, miraculously, I had been given another chance. And this time, I wouldn't waste it.
6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of the lake house looking out over the water. It was Thanksgiving, and for the first time in 15 years, my entire family was gathering under one roof. The path to this moment had not been easy. The legal consequences of my deception had been embarrassing, but manageable. A fine for filing false documents, community service hours, and a formal apology to the funeral home and cemetery. The emotional consequences had been harder to navigate. Family therapy had been challenging, forcing us to confront long-buried resentments and misunderstandings. There had been sessions where we'd all left angry or in tears. But slowly, painfully, we'd begun to rebuild trust, not just between me and my children, but among the siblings themselves. I'd learned painful truths about my parenting, ways I had inadvertently played favorites, times I had dismissed feelings that deserved attention. My children had confronted their own roles in the family rift, the stubbornness and pride that had kept them apart long after the original offense had faded from memory. The lake house had been a surprising part of our healing journey. When we discovered that Catherine was the only one who had kept her share, Richard had suggested we buy the property back, together, as a family. It had taken months of negotiations with the developer, but eventually we'd succeeded. The house needed work after years of neglect, and fixing it up had become a family project, giving us a common goal to work toward. "Mom, do you know where the big serving platter is?" Elizabeth called from the dining room, interrupting my reverie. "Check the bottom cabinet beside the sink. It might be tucked behind the roasting pan." The house was alive with activity. Elizabeth and her husband were setting the table. Thomas was supervising the children as they made place cards for everyone. Richard and Karen were bringing in extra chairs from the porch. Catherine and Rachel were arranging flowers and vases throughout the house. It wasn't perfect harmony. Richard and Thomas still occasionally fell into old patterns of competition. Elizabeth sometimes grew impatient with Catherine's more free-spirited approach to life. But the difference was that now they worked through these moments instead of letting them fester. As for me, I was learning to be a different kind of mother, one who supported without controlling, who offered advice only when asked, who accepted that my adult children had the right to make their own choices, even when those choices differed from what I would have done. Individual therapy had helped me understand the roots of my controlling behavior, my fear of losing my family, my misguided belief that I could force happiness if I just planned carefully enough. I was learning to let go, to trust in the bonds of family without trying to micromanage them. Grandma, my youngest grandchild, Emily, came running into the kitchen, her face alight with excitement. "Dad says we can go swimming next summer when the weather gets warm. Will you swim with us?" I smiled, lifting her onto my hip despite my protesting joints. "I'd love to, sweetheart. I used to be quite the swimmer in my day." Mom was a regular mermaid,
Catherine confirmed, entering the kitchen with a vase of fall flowers. "She taught all of us to swim right off that dock." "Is that where you're going to teach me?" Emily asked eagerly. "That's exactly where," Catherine promised. The doorbell rang, announcing the arrival of Mabel, who had been invited to join our Thanksgiving as an honorary family member. Her role in my ill-conceived plan had initially made her somewhat unwelcome, but over time, my children had forgiven her, perhaps more easily than they had forgiven me. Thomas went to let her in, and I heard his warm greeting, followed by Mabel's booming laugh. She appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, carrying a large pie. "Happy Thanksgiving, everyone!" And before anyone asks, yes, this is a real pie, not a fake one. Unlike some people, I don't believe in elaborate deceptions involving food. There was a moment of startled silence. Then everyone, including me, burst into laughter. It had taken months, but we had finally reached a point where we could joke about the incident, as it had come to be known. "Very funny, Mabel," I said, embracing my oldest friend. "Just for that, you get the smallest slice." "Worth it," she declared, setting the pie on the counter. As the afternoon progressed, the house filled with the sounds I had missed for so long. Laughter, conversation, the happy shrieks of children playing, the comfortable buzz of family together. We gathered around the table, and Richard, as the eldest, was about to say grace when Thomas interrupted. "Actually, I thought Mom might like to do the honors this year." Richard hesitated, then nodded, passing the symbolic torch to me. I looked around the table at the faces of my family, children, in-laws, grandchildren, dear friends, and felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it momentarily robbed me of speech. "Mom?" Catherine prompted gently. I cleared my throat. "I'm thankful for second chances, for forgiveness, even when it's not deserved, for family in all its messy, complicated glory, and most of all, for the truth that no matter how painful it might be, it's always better than the most comforting lie." There were nods around the table. A few tears quickly blinked away. "Now let's eat before the food gets cold," I added pragmatically, and everyone laughed. As plates were passed and conversations flowed, I caught Mabel's eye across the table. She gave me a small, knowing smile, a reminder of how far we'd come from that ill-fated funeral 6 months ago. My plan had been a disaster, a manipulation that had nearly cost me everything. But in its failure, it had created space for something more genuine to grow, a reconciliation based not on deception, but on honest confrontation with the past. Sometimes, I reflected as I watched my family together, the most valuable lessons come from our worst mistakes. And sometimes the thing we've been searching for has been there all along, waiting patiently for us to stop trying so hard and simply let it be. "More gravy, Mom?" Richard asked, offering the boat. "Yes, please," I said, holding out my plate. And Richard, "Thank you." He didn't ask what I was thanking him for. He didn't need to. Instead, he simply smiled. A real smile, warm and genuine, and said, "You're welcome." And in that moment, I knew that while our family would never be perfect, it was whole again, and that was more than enough.